Okay, so you think FIFA is just a giant sports corporation. You open the app, buy a ticket, and settle in to watch the World Cup final. Somewhere out there, a global sports company is cashing in on your excitement, right? A giant corporation selling you the biggest show on earth. That's the story, right? Sounds like you already understand it. Wrong. FIFA is not a company. It has no shareholders, no stock price, no owner to answer to. It's a nonprofit association registered in Switzerland, the same legal category as a local chess club. And yet that chess club is projecting roughly $13 billion in revenue for its 2023 to 2026 cycle, more than 3 times what it made in the cycle before. Not a media conglomerate, not a ticketing company, not even really a sports league. It's something stranger. 211 countries bound by one contract, and FIFA sitting at the top of every single one. By the end of this, you'll understand why FIFA doesn't compete for football fans the way McDonald's competes for lunch, why a $20 kitty in 1974 rebuilt the entire business, and why your ticket is the smallest part of the machine. To see how, you need to go back to a cramped office in Paris, 1904. Picture a rented room at 229 Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris, above the offices of a French sports magazine. It's May 21st, 1904. A 28-year-old journalist named Robert Guérin has invited delegates from 7 countries: Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, to sign a single piece of paper. There's no stadium outside, no sponsor logo on the wall, no television camera, just 7 signatures and a shared agreement to follow one set of rules for a game that, until that morning, every country played by its own version. England, the country that invented modern football, doesn't even bother showing up. Its football association considers itself important enough not to need this club, and it will take another 2 years before England finally joins. Guérin becomes the first president of an organization with almost no money and no power to enforce anything beyond the paper it was written on. For a quarter of a century, growth is slow and almost entirely administrative. More countries sign the same agreement. A World Cup gets invented in 1930 by a later president, Jules Rimet, and the whole operation still runs out of a handful of rented rooms in Europe. By 1974, 70 years after that first meeting in Paris, the organization has grown from 7 members to well over 100, but its bank account hasn't grown anywhere near as fast. It's still running out of what one insider later described as an old house with about $20 left in the account, staffed by a dozen people in Zurich. Membership had scaled, money hadn't. And that gap between how big FIFA had become and how poor it still was is exactly the moment everything is about to change. The man who ran FIFA in 1974 was Sir Stanley Rouse, an Englishman who saw football as a gentleman's amateur pastime, not a business to be run for growth. Waiting to challenge him was João Havelange, a Brazilian lawyer with no revenue and no infrastructure behind him, only a plan and a promise. Rouse had run FIFA for Europe, largely by Europeans, for Europeans. Havelange offered something Rouse never had. He promised to expand the World Cup itself, pulling in nations from Africa, Asia, and the Americas who had almost no real voice under the old order, and giving every member, not just the traditional European powers, a direct incentive to vote for him. He toured 86 countries campaigning, often with Pelé at his side, and beat Rouse by 16 votes in a second-round ballot. He inherited an organization so broke that he later described finding an old house and about $20 in the account. He didn't try to run it like a sports federation. He ran it like a company that had never once tried to make a profit. To fund the promises he'd made on that world tour, he turned to Horst Dassler, the man behind Adidas, and Dassler brought in Coca-Cola as a sponsor and a marketer named Patrick Nally to package the whole relationship for sale. Havelange wasn't selling football. He was selling access to football's audience. And for the first time, FIFA had something outside companies actually wanted to buy. By the time he left office 24 years later, having doubled the World Cup from 16 teams to 32, he would claim to have turned that original $20 kitty into an organization holding billions of dollars in property and contracts. This is the decision that built the modern organization. Not a better product, not a bigger stadium, but a new kind of contract between FIFA and global brands. Economists have a name for what that contract created. Here's the label. FIFA runs what amounts to a global rights auction, and it is the only seller in the world with this exact product. When you watch a match on Fox or the BBC, you assume you're watching a broadcaster's coverage of a football tournament. What you're actually watching is a broadcaster's license, sold territory by territory, for the exclusive right to show something nobody else on Earth is allowed to sell. For the 2023 to 2026 cycle, FIFA has budgeted roughly $4.26 billion in television and broadcasting revenue, and industry estimates put the media rights tied to the 2026 World Cup alone at close to $3.8 to $3.9 billion dollars, an increase of about 22% over the tournament held in Qatar 4 years earlier. Walk the actual deals and the mechanism gets clearer. Fox and Telemundo paid a combined $1.25 billion, the most valuable territorial rights agreement in World Cup history, to lock up the US market alone. European public broadcasters, the BBC and ITV in the UK, ARD and ZDF in Germany, and dozens of others all signed their own separate deals, because FIFA's broadcast portfolio now spans more than 190 territories, each one negotiated as its own closed contract at whatever price that specific market will bear. China's broadcasters, by contrast, reportedly settled their 2026 package for around $60 million, a fraction of the American price, for the same matches, sold to a different territory with different negotiating leverage. That's the mechanism in miniature. FIFA isn't pricing a product, it's pricing access to a specific audience, country by country, and every single deal is negotiated from the position of a monopoly seller. Sponsorship works the same way. FIFA's commercial partners are expected to pay around $2.4 billion for the 2026 cycle, a 37% jump from Qatar, plus another $669 million in licensing fees for everything from video games to jerseys stamped with the tournament crest. None of it is optional if a brand wants to be anywhere near the World Cup, because there's only one World Cup to be near. Think of it like a toll booth on the only bridge into a city. It doesn't matter how much you're willing to pay somewhere else. There is no somewhere else. No rival organization owns the rights to stage a competing men's World Cup, so no broadcaster can shop around. Nike doesn't get to build a second Air Jordan. A Fox can't go build a second World Cup. FIFA is the sole supplier of the single most watched live sporting event on the planet, and the price of every rights deal reflects that scarcity, not the cost of producing the football itself. This is the visible engine, the one that shows up in headlines every 4 years. Broadcasters bidding against each other in market after market for a license FIFA is the only entity capable of issuing. It is genuinely enormous money. It is also, as the next mechanism reveals, nowhere near the whole story of how FIFA actually operates between tournaments. So if the broadcasting auction is the visible business, where does the money actually go, and why does it matter that FIFA legally isn't a company at all? Here's the number that changes everything. Every 4-year cycle, FIFA doesn't send its revenue out to shareholders because it has none. Instead, it channels billions of dollars back down through a program called FIFA Forward, and this is the part almost nobody watching the final on television has ever heard of. Under the current phase, Forward 3.0, every single one of FIFA's 211 member associations, whether they're Brazil or a tiny island federation that has never come close to qualifying for a World Cup, receives up to $8 million over the 4-year cycle, no strings attached beyond basic compliance. Across the whole system, that program alone is worth roughly $2.25 billion, a nearly 7-fold increase from the funding levels before 2016. During the COVID-19 pandemic, FIFA released an additional $1.5 billion in relief grants to the same network of federations almost overnight, proof that the reserves exist specifically to be deployed like this. There's a legal reason this works exactly this way. As a nonprofit association under Swiss law, FIFA has no obligation to maximize returns for owners, because by definition, it has none. Its own statutes describe its purpose as developing football globally, not generating shareholder value. That single legal distinction changes everything about how the organization is allowed to behave. A public company that built up billions in cash reserves between revenue events would face constant pressure from investors demanding dividends or buybacks. FIFA faces no such pressure because the 211 member federations that technically own the association through their votes are also the ones receiving the reserve payouts. The incentive to hoard cash and redistribute it strategically rather than pay it out to any single stakeholder is built directly into the legal form FIFA chose over a century ago and never had a reason to abandon. This is structurally different from the broadcasting business just described. That mechanism was a sale. A broadcaster pays, FIFA delivers a license, the transaction ends. This mechanism is a loop. FIFA collects from broadcasters and sponsors, holds the surplus as reserves between tournaments, then redistributes a portion of it to every federation on Earth, regardless of size, wealth, or football relevance. It isn't philanthropy. Money with strings attached is influence, and 211 votes is exactly what decides who becomes FIFA president, which country hosts the next World Cup, and which rule changes pass at Congress. A federation that receives $8 million guaranteed dollars every 4 years purely for existing has very little incentive to challenge the organization writing the check. Nike doesn't send free product to stores that hate the brand. FIFA does something close to the opposite, on purpose. Picture a landlord who owns every building in a city and hands every tenant a rent rebate each year, funded entirely by the handful of tenants paying the highest rents. The rebate keeps everyone loyal. The high rent tenants keep paying because there's nowhere else to rent. That's the real profit center at FIFA. Not the World Cup itself, but the redistribution system the World Cup's money quietly funds. And it's a structure no ordinary company chasing shareholder returns would ever be built to run. So why has nobody built a rival? Why doesn't a wealthy consortium just start a competing global tournament and undercut FIFA's rights fees? Try mapping out what it would actually take, and the moat becomes obvious fast. FIFA isn't just an event organizer, it's the single body every national football federation on the planet is contractually required to belong to, if that federation wants its teams playing internationally at all. All 211 of them signed FIFA's statutes to get into international football in the first place, which means leaving isn't really an option. A federation that breaks away doesn't get to keep playing anyone. This is why FIFA can enforce rules that would be unthinkable in an ordinary market. When a government interferes too directly in how a national federation runs itself, FIFA can and does suspend that entire country from international competition until the interference stops. Federations in countries including Pakistan, Kuwait, and India have all faced suspension in the past decade over exactly this kind of government overreach, cutting their national teams off from every FIFA-sanctioned match on Earth, World Cup qualifying included. No private company gets to freeze a country out of an entire industry. FIFA does it as a matter of routine governance, because every federation needs FIFA far more than FIFA needs any single one of them. Then there's the trademark itself. World Cup isn't a generic phrase for a big football tournament, it's a brand FIFA controls and licenses. The same way a company controls a registered name. Anyone staging a rival global tournament couldn't call it a World Cup, couldn't recruit players from FIFA-affiliated clubs without risking their careers, and couldn't book stadiums or broadcasters that depend on staying in FIFA's good graces for everything else they do in football. Watch what happened when a group of Europe's richest clubs tried something structurally similar in 2021, launching a breakaway Super League outside the traditional football pyramid. Fans revolted within days, and UEFA and FIFA both threatened to ban the participating clubs' players from World Cups and domestic leagues entirely. The Super League collapsed in under 72 hours. That collapse is the clearest evidence of the moat in action. Even clubs with billions of dollars in combined revenue couldn't survive being cut off from the pyramid FIFA sits on top of. There's a compounding logic underneath all of this that makes the gap widen instead of close. Players want to play in the tournament with the most prestige and the biggest global audience, so the best players show up. Broadcasters want the tournament the most players and viewers are already committed to, So they keep bidding FIFA's way instead of building anything of their own. Sponsors want the broadcaster's audience, so they follow the same money. Every actor in the system is rationally choosing FIFA precisely because every other actor already has, which is the definition of a network effect. And network effects don't erode on their own. They only break if something forces every participant to defect at the same time, which is exactly what didn't happen with the Super League. And the moat doesn't just hold steady, it widens every cycle. FIFA controls which confederations are even eligible to bid to host each World Cup, rotating hosting rights by region in a system it designs and enforces. When Saudi Arabia wanted to host the 2034 tournament, FIFA structured the bidding calendar so that only the Asian and Oceania confederations were eligible that cycle. And when Australia declined to bid, Saudi Arabia became the only candidate left standing, confirmed as host in an uncontested vote at the end of 2024. That's not an accident of geography. That's an organization with enough control over the entire pipeline, teams, players, broadcasters, host nations, to decide who even gets a chance to compete for the right to spend billions building stadiums. Every year that passes, more broadcasters sign multi-cycle deals, more sponsors build campaigns years in advance, and more national federations become financially dependent on FIFA forward payments, which makes the whole system harder to challenge, not easier. Economists call this exact pattern a two-sided network effect, where the value to each side of the market grows as the other side grows. And it's genuinely difficult to build from scratch precisely because there's no version of a rival tournament that starts with 211 already loyal member federations, decades of broadcaster relationships, and every major sponsor already invested in the incumbent. Any rival would need to convince federations to defect, sponsors to switch, and broadcasters to bet on an unproven audience, all at once, and all before a single ticket is sold. Which is precisely why, in over a century, nobody has managed it. This is what an economic moat looks like when the product isn't a factory or a patent, but legal control over who is allowed to play the world's most popular sport at all. None of this works, though, without something that has nothing to do with contracts. You. FIFA isn't really selling football, it's selling belonging, and it prices that belonging accordingly. A World Cup only happens once every 4 years, and that scarcity is deliberate. It's what turns a match into an event you rearrange your entire life around, rather than one game among hundreds in a normal season. For the 2026 tournament, FIFA introduced dynamic pricing for tickets for the first time in the competition's history, letting prices for the biggest matches climb the way flight or hotel prices do, based on demand in real time. Resale listings for the final reportedly climbed toward $2 million a seat, and the pricing system drew enough scrutiny to trigger a state-level investigation in the US. You're not just paying for 90 minutes of football when that happens, you're paying for the feeling that you might never get another shot at this exact moment. FIFA already knows exactly where that emotional pull is strongest. Of FIFA's 26 global commercial backers for the current cycle, 14 are based in the United States. More than half, concentrated deliberately around a market FIFA has spent years trying to convert from casual interest into the kind of obsession the sport commands almost everywhere else. Pricing, sponsorship, and scheduling all get built around the assumption that identity, not product quality, is what turns a casual viewer into someone who'll pay almost anything not to miss it. Sponsors understand the same psychology from the other direction. A company doesn't become a FIFA partner to reach people who already like football. It becomes a partner to borrow the emotion football already has and attach its own logo to it. When you see a soft drink brand or a payments company plastered across the World Cup, the product being sold isn't the drink or the card. It's the implied message that this brand is part of the biggest shared moment on the planet. And so, by extension, are you if you buy it. That's brand equity, built entirely on borrowed emotion rather than anything the sponsor manufactures. And underneath both of those tactics sits the oldest trick in the book, identity. You don't cheer for a national team because of its business model. You cheer because that team is wearing your country's colors, and for 90 minutes, its results feel like your results. FIFA didn't invent national pride, but it built the only stage on Earth where 211 countries worth of that pride gets funneled through one organization's gates, one broadcast contract, one ticketing system every 4 years. That's not an accident of good timing. That's the entire psychological architecture the two financial mechanisms just described were built to monetize. None of this is without real, ongoing risk, and this channel doesn't pretend otherwise. On May 27, 2015, Swiss police arrested 7 FIFA officials in Zurich at the request of the US Department of Justice, just as the organization's own Congress was about to convene. The US indictment ran 47 counts across 14 defendants, alleging more than $150 million in bribes and kickbacks paid out over roughly 24 years, including allegations connected to how South Africa won the right to host the 2010 World Cup, and separate Swiss criminal proceedings opened the same week specifically into the bidding for the 2018 and 2022 tournaments, eventually awarded to Russia and Qatar. FIFA's president at the time, Sepp Blatter, wasn't among those arrested, but he resigned within days as the pressure mounted. That scandal forced FIFA to create an audit and compliance committee and rewrite parts of its governance structure, but the underlying vulnerability never fully disappeared. An organization with this much unchallenged control over hosting decisions worth tens of billions of dollars is always one leaked email away from another investigation. Current FIFA president Gianni Infantino, who took office in the aftermath of the 2015 scandal promising reform, has since built an unusually close relationship with Saudi Arabia's leadership, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, visiting the kingdom repeatedly in the years leading up to the 2034 hosting decision. Critics point to that relationship as evidence the same dynamics that produced the 2015 indictments: concentrated power, limited outside oversight, and hosting decisions made behind closed doors were never fully dismantled, just rebranded. The 2034 hosting decision carries its own version of that risk. Saudi Arabia's bid went uncontested after FIFA restricted eligibility to the Asian and Oceania confederations, and Australia chose not to compete. And the Norwegian Football Federation formally objected in writing, criticizing what it called the seemingly predetermined nature of the entire process. Human rights organizations have raised similar concerns about the kingdom's record, echoing criticism FIFA also faced ahead of Qatar in 2022. Separately, some of European football's most powerful institutions, the Premier League, La Liga, and the Players' Union FIFPro Europe, filed a legal complaint with the European Commission, challenging FIFA's control over the international match calendar around the expanded Club World Cup and the 2026 World Cup itself. None of these threats are guaranteed to change how FIFA operates, but they point at the same underlying tension running through this entire video. An organization built on being the only supplier of the world's biggest sporting event has enormous room to set its own terms, and very little built-in accountability forcing it to set them fairly. So where does this actually go from here? In the optimistic version, the pattern that just played out keeps repeating and even accelerates. FIFA's 2023 to 2026 cycle is on track to land close to $13 billion in total revenue, up roughly 72% from the previous cycle's $7.6 billion, helped by the expanded 48-team World Cup format, a Club World Cup that alone reportedly generated around $2 billion in 2025, and dynamic ticket pricing squeezing more revenue out of the same stadiums. If dynamic pricing survives the regulatory attention it's already drawing, if the 26 commercial partners currently signed on keep renewing at higher rates, and if the redistribution machine keeps 211 federations financially dependent and politically quiet, FIFA heads into the 2034 Saudi Arabia World Cup as arguably the wealthiest governing body any sport has ever produced. In the harder version, several of those variables break at once instead of holding. A state-level investigation into World Cup ticket pricing could force FIFA to roll back the dynamic pricing model that's been inflating per-seat revenue, right as sponsors and broadcasters start pricing in growing expectations. The legal complaint from the Premier League, La Liga, and FIFPro Europe over calendar control could, if it succeeds, force FIFA to share both scheduling power and revenue with the clubs and leagues that actually develop the players fans pay to watch. Human rights criticism of the Saudi Arabia hosting decision could cost FIFA a handful of Western sponsors unwilling to be associated with the backlash, the same tension that shadowed Qatar in 2022 without ultimately costing FIFA much at all. And because more than 90% of FIFA's total revenue arrives in a single concentrated burst around each World Cup, any disruption to one tournament, a boycott, a security crisis, a broadcaster pulling out, hits the entire 4-year budget at once, not just a quarter of it. FIFA's own revenue targets have already needed revising upward twice this cycle. The original target for 2023 to 2026 was $11 billion, and after two separate revisions, the real number closed in on nearly $13 billion instead. Proof of just how much unplanned upside a single World Cup can generate when ticket demand, sponsorship renewals, and broadcast bidding all land better than projected. On the downside, FIFA's heavy reliance on a small number of anchor sponsors and broadcasters means that losing even 2 or 3 of the biggest deals, a Fox-sized broadcaster or a Coca-Cola-sized sponsor, could remove a meaningful share of total cycle revenue in a single move, given how concentrated at the top those contracts are. Both scenarios assume the World Cup itself. FIFA's single largest revenue event comes off without major disruption. Take that assumption away, and every other variable becomes secondary. The gap between those two futures isn't small. A best case built on renewed sponsorships, stable ticket pricing, and an uneventful Saudi Arabia tournament could push FIFA's following cycle revenue well past the $13 billion it's on pace for now. A worst case, even a partial one involving just the ticket pricing rollback and a handful of lost Western sponsors, could plausibly cost FIFA a meaningful slice of that same total without threatening the organization's survival, because the 211-member redistribution system that keeps federations loyal doesn't depend on any single sponsor or any single controversy going away. FIFA has survived worse before, including a near collapse of its own leadership in 2015. But the same structure that makes FIFA nearly impossible to compete against also makes it almost entirely dependent on one event once every 4 years, going right. So the next time you hold a World Cup ticket or even just watch the final on your couch, remember what that ticket actually is. It's not FIFA's product. It's the smallest, most visible transaction in a system built from 211 mandatory members, a redistribution machine most fans never see, and a hosting calendar FIFA alone controls. FIFA isn't a football tournament that happens to make money. It's a compulsory global membership with a football tournament attached, not a company selling you a game, but the only gate the entire sport has to walk through, 4 years at a time.